We're meeting in the City Center Conference Room, Tuesday, July 9th, 2019 at 3 o'clock, and this is the Municipal Council work session. I'd like to excuse Chair Harding, who's out of town, so I'm sitting in this chair today. Also, Council Member Dave Sewell is out of town, so excuse both of them. I'd like to start with an opening prayer. Dave, of course, please.
Heavenly Father, we give thanks for this opportunity to meet together as a Provo City Council and discuss the needs and concerns of the community. And we pray for your Spirit to be with us and all those that present, that we might be able to listen, learn, and make the right decisions. In the name of thy Son, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Thank you, Dave. I skipped the roll call first thing already, so let's have a roll call start. Cliff
Strachan.
Brian Jones.
Dave Knacht.
George Handley.
Elizabeth Van Erken.
Kay Van Buren.
Gary Winterton.
Hannah Salzel.
George Stewart.
Mayor Kafusi.
Wayne Parker.
Isaac Paxman.
Thank you. Cliff, were either of those council members going to try and call for this meeting?
Yeah, let me explain that. So, Council Member Harding is actually is watching it on YouTube, and we've set up a Google Hangouts in case he wants to message in anything. And at this point, I think he's just going to watch.
Okay. Right. If you notice if something else needs to be brought up, just give me the word. First of all, I'd like to approve some minutes from the April 9th, 2019 work meeting. Also, the April 23rd, 2019 joint meeting with the Transportation and Mobility Advisory Committee. Are there any requested changes or objections to approving those minutes? Okay, seeing no objection, we'll declare those minutes approved by unanimous consent. Really want to hear from the public, but we'll go through this anyway. Although this is a public meeting, only the presenters and those seated in the council at the council table may speak or ask questions, unless otherwise invited by the chair. Our first item is a discussion regarding a proposed permitted parking plan ordinance amendment. And Brian Jones, our council attorney, will lead this discussion.
Thank you. This discussion comes from an effort by the Policy Governance Committee to address some issues with the way permit parking plans are adopted. I think they started out with a discussion of, at least one of the discussion points was whether there were possible ways to streamline the process, or whether it was advisable to streamline the process. In the end, we didn't end up doing away with the hearings that are already required, but we did ask for some planning commission input, which was kind of the big major change. Hannah, do you have the ordinance that you can put up on the screen? So I'd like to just quickly run through the changes. If we go down to
It wasn't part of the meeting documents, so I'll pull it up.
probably was in the meeting documents, but I'll just put it on. Well, I can run you through without necessarily needing to see it, but we proposed amending the definition section. I mean, I think it's in your material, so hopefully everybody's had a chance to look at it. But we changed the definition of dwelling to match the definition in the zoning code. It already actually basically matched, but it was just a repeat, and so we just did a cross-reference in. We changed the definition of a parking permit to refer to our new system of actually using a license plate reader rather than having mirror hanging permits. And then the major changes were in the designation process. And so the proposal now is to say that if there's a proposal to designate a permit parking area or to amend an area, it can be initiated by a municipal council member, which was already the case, or the mayor, which was already the case, or any Provo City resident who resides in the area specified in the application. And then we've kind of streamlined how the process at least reads in the in the ordinance. Anybody who wants to initiate one, whether that's a council member, the mayor, or a resident, starts by submitting a amendment request on a form to be provided presumably by community development that identifies the boundaries, includes a statement of the reason and justifications, and a statement that how creating the proposed permit parking area would promote the objectives set forth in this chapter. Then, if it's being initiated by a private citizen rather than the mayor or a council member, they have to submit additional information, which is a petition, again on a form approved by this parking coordinator, that includes a map, a list of the name, address, and signature of every resident who within the boundaries who's in support, a statement that summarizes the proposal, the desired parking time restrictions and exemptions, and anything else that the applicant wishes to propose. And then they have to pay a filing fee as set forth in the consolidated fee schedule. So again, one of the things that was discussed quite a bit in the committee is we anticipate that what will most likely happen is that residents would come to the council member for their district and ask that council member to sponsor it so that they wouldn't have to pay the filing fee. Because if the council member actually brings it forward, then they're not subject to the filing fee.
How much was the proposed fee?
It was the same as any text amendment. I think it was $1,100.
Or $11.50.
Yeah, it was around $1,150. The same as any other text amendment, code text amendment. And then the other major change was that we added. So remember that under the current process, once the petition is submitted, then the parking coordinator has to review it and create a report. The thing that was added to the process is now the parking coordinator actually sends that report to the planning commission at the same time that they send it to the mayor and council. And within 90 days, the planning commission is required to consider it and make a recommendation to the council. And then after receiving the recommendation from the planning commission, then the council holds their first public hearing on it. And other than that, there's some other changes, but most of the rest of the changes are all just like technical cleanup stuff to deal with the fact that it's license plate readers instead of, and to handle some process issues about, calling 311 in order to get a temporary permit. So 1,100 is the proposed fee. So that's all I had, unless you have specific questions.
I have just an informational question. Do we only do license readers now? Do we actually send people out to mark tires and do those things now? Or are we able to do it basically through license plate readers?
We do for some things. For parking permits, we have moved entirely to license plate review. So overtime parking, handicap parking, we'll do some of those other kinds of options. But for permits, we just now have people give us if they're entitled to 2 parking permits, they give us 2 license plates. When they renew their permit, and they can change those at any point in time. We're just about entirely online with that now, and able to print temporary parking permits online. So on the Provo 360 City process created some new options for us. But in terms of parking permits, we have moved on pretty much exclusively now to the license plate reader.
That's awesome.
If it was 72 hours on the street, that might be different.
Yes. Yeah, well, and again, for that's correct. We could chalk tires for those, take a photograph, right, timed photograph. License plate reader can also do that, so we can identify the timestamp, the LPR review of that vehicle, and then it'll flag us when 72 hours is expired, and we can drive out and see if it's still there. So again, that can happen either way. But on permits, we're not doing any more, better be careful to say that. For the most part, there may be, like Pleasant View may not be yet, given kind of the nature of that predated our parking permit programs. But I think for all the ones that have been adopted by the council, we're now using license plate numbers.
And are we comfortable with our license plate reader situation right now?
We have one on order, and I think we've got budgeted funds to do one more still, beyond what we've already got in place, so I think we're good.
Any other discussion on this item? Questions? Brian?
Schedule-wise, I think we would be looking for, I mean, the chair could always schedule it himself, but otherwise I think we'd be looking for a motion to move this to a future council meeting for approval.
Now, is this going to go to the planning commission?
Oh,
Yes.
yes, because we're making, well, no, actually, this is all this, I mean, it doesn't have to. This is all changes to Title IX, so we're not making any changes to Title 14 or 15, so it doesn't need to go to the planning commission. But I suppose there is a question about whether or not you want feedback from the planning commission about whether they want to be involved in the process. Since you're kind of mandating that they be involved in the process. And I think Gary McGinn was involved in these drafts.
Didn't we reach out and ask?
Yeah, I know we talked to Gary McGinn about it, and he expressed support. I don't know if he specifically talked to the planning commission about it. I don't remember that.
I think he probably would have suggested it go there if he thought it was necessary.
Yeah, and I don't remember that being
That
a
seems to be necessary.
suggestion.
So, when it comes to the planning commission, I mean, it's kind of, do they want to be involved? That's good to know. Do we want them involved? And personally, I would kind of like their opinion and like that kind of involvement so that they, I mean, you might say it's kind of getting down into the weeds, but I think it helps them understand the impact of land use decisions which come around eventually to sometimes needing parking permit programs.
One option you could do is you could by motion move this to the next meeting for approval, but also ask Gary McGinn to come to that meeting with any feedback from the planning commission about their involvement in the process.
I like that motion, and I'd like to make that motion.
Okay, so let's state it more clearly, as we'll see.
Do you have any question? It would be to bring this to the next, can we do it, the next city council meeting with a request of Gary McGinn to relay any advice from the planning commission.
So what does that do to, I mean, I like what Dave was saying about getting them involved, because I think it's important that we're asking the same kinds of questions with regard to land use. So I would like them involved, but if Gary's just coming to comment, does that mean it's not actually going to the planning commission, or he would make a recommendation that it go, or not?
Well, I probably misunderstood. I had understood Dave as saying that he likes the idea of parking permit proposals going to the planning commission, so he's supportive of this as drafted, not necessarily that he was saying he wants this proposal to go to the planning commission. But if you want that to happen, if you want a formal recommendation from the planning commission on whether to approve this change, then I think you need to have a substitute motion to that effect.
Yeah, I guess that's, I mean, as long as what you're saying, the parking permit questions should go.
And that's what the ordinance calls for.
This ordinance
Okay.
requires it to go to the planning commission, that's part of it.
Yeah, and I don't think we need to necessarily go down that road again and say, gee, planning commission, do you want to be part of this? Because I think we want them to be part of this, regardless of how they may feel. I mean, I would hope they'd be excited, but I think the question was asked and went beyond Gary's purview.
Yeah.
And I guess what I was anticipating when I suggested that motion was I would assume that if between now and the next meeting, Gary becomes aware that the planning commission has serious concerns about being involved in this process, that he'll come tell you that, and in the next meeting you can say, well then let's continue it again and find out more.
Then I like the motion.
Okay, so there's a motion made, we have not got a second yet for that motion.
I'll second.
George, you have a second? Any other discussion? So all in favor of the motion? That's unanimous. Thank you. Item 2 is a discussion regarding a resolution of support for the recommendation from the Utah County Good Governance Board regarding the Utah County structure of government. And Cliff Strachan, our council executive director, will lead this discussion.
Council members, we've seen this as I've circulated it previously. Several months ago, the question of changing the form of government got a kickstart when Strengthen Utah County, a political issues committee, formed and started gathering signatures with a proposal to change the form of government to a mayor-council format. But they've been unable to collect enough signatures. In the meantime, as a result, the county commission engaged the Good Governance Advisory Board, which our mayor sat on, and they came back with 6 strong recommendations which promote the idea of going to a council mayor form of government. This morning, and those results were presented a couple weeks ago to the county. This morning, about an hour before the the commission meeting, the Commissioner Lee and four associates filed another petition to put the question of a ballot question of a 5-commissioner form of government on the ballot, and they claim he claims that they're going to collect petitions and signatures and try and get that on the ballot. There's a question now of what's going to happen. The other 2 commissioners feel like they got kicked in the teeth by that action, and they felt like it was as the Salt Lake Tribune characterized it, a filibuster to the process that the Good Governance Advisory Board started. Anyway, that's to be resolved. They adjourned today without having voted on moving this forward. I think they're seeking some legal advice from within their jurisdiction to figure out what can happen. That said, if you are supportive of this resolution, tonight you'll have the opportunity to vote on it and move it forward. At least put Provo Council's position forward that they'd like to see this, that you'd like to see this process move forward, and that those 6 recommendations be implemented.
So, as luck would have it, on July 4th, we had that little breakfast at Provo High, and you get to talk to people, and I sat down with Bill, and he was saying that he had reservations about form of government. He felt that, from what he had heard or his experience, that instead of being maybe a balanced form of government, he felt that it would put too much power in the hands of the one person, the mayor, and that he felt, well, the implication was that he would have felt better maybe about a 5, he didn't bring it up, he didn't say I'd like a 5-member commission, but I'm not surprised to hear that he went forward down that road because of what he was saying. And so that was kind of at the heart of his concern, is to keep the commission in control. With 5 members, at least would be more functional, so the 2 of them can talk to each other and not say it's a public meeting or something. But that's very interesting.
And the other 2 were lined up, ready to vote to move this forward, and they felt stymied today, so they're not sure where to go.
They can't move it forward with 2 of the 3 voting in favor?
I think that's what they're trying to figure out. The law is a little bit ambiguous. It anticipates one petition process going forward, not that at the last minute somebody would start another petition process.
Whereas the previous petition, it ran out yesterday.
It ran out yesterday.
And they didn't get enough?
Didn't get enough signatures.
Yeah, we tried.
So,
They kind of quit trying.
Yeah, when the new committee was
Had everything on board,
appointed, they
so,
said, okay, fine, you committee, come up with your recommendation, we'll back off.
Do this, so we were baffled.
Yeah, I'd really be interested in your perspective, at sitting on that board. To me, this is a reason I think we need to do this. I can see this. I think
Exhibit A.
Exactly, that's kind of
That's
what we all
exactly
been texting back and forth today, and this is exactly why. So there were 15 members on the board from all kinds of backgrounds, academia, media, political, and we were asked to sit on this board and just vet everything. We put in hours and hours of listening to citizens and other elected officials, and our task was to come up with recommendations after we heard from the public. And so we met all throughout the valley, did everything we could to get public outreach, and we got a lot of public outreach. And then it came down to these 6 recommendations, and that's kind of where we landed. So we were all really surprised, especially since the vote was a 3-0 vote from Commissioner Lee, Commissioner Ivey, and Commissioner Ainge to put this committee together and give the recommendation. So we do feel a little bit, well, I felt really surprised that like the rug got pulled out from underneath us this morning.
Well, Commissioner Lee has a different view, maybe preserve a job.
they were asking
But
what
I
his
think it's
motive was.
absolutely important and critical that we pass this resolution. I think it's without question because we're,
Yeah.
Well,
and I'm not being critical, I mean, everybody has the right to view, but I think the overwhelming view of the county is to do what the committee recommended.
yeah.
So many of the elected officials, people in the know that understand what should happen, I think they're overwhelmingly in favor of what's proposed.
So it would be just, in fact, they used our form of government as their model. There would be 5 areas, 5 districts, and then 2 citywide, and a strong mayor with the CAO. Cameron Martin was the committee chair, the vice president at UVU. So he said, he's a little concerned about this as well, how things went down this morning. He's going to come tonight to speak to you all and just let you just ask any questions you have. So I'll talk about it, and then I'll turn the time over to Cameron, and feel free to ask him any questions.
Well, one question I want to ask publicly to make sure that everybody hears it. I thought Bill Lee spoke when he said that there wasn't any public. He said something that there wasn't
That's
enough
what's
public
really
input on
bothering
this.
Cameron and
Yeah.
all of the committee
So I
members.
want people to understand the process that's gone.
So that'll be a great question for him. In fact, I just sent out to the group, political drama, grab your popcorn, because that's what it feels like, right? I mean, we've all worked hard and came to a conclusion, and now someone pulls the rug out from underneath us at the last minute, and that's all I've
And
heard.
pull the word out only if they succeed. If they succeed, won't it still be on the ballot to go to the form that you recommended?
I don't think it, so it's shady, like Cliff was saying. We have the attorneys looking into it. They don't even have a straight answer for us. They just said it is now at a standstill because of this petition. Yeah.
So is it too late in the season? Don't they have time windows that they have to?
They do. They technically have to decide to get it on the ballot about July 23rd. And so by putting it on a petition, he potentially stops it for a whole election cycle.
Because I think he has until, the article said until January to gather signatures.
So it just stops.
This is, okay, thank you.
This is where, from a political standpoint, if city councils and mayors across the county were to stand up and argue against that move, maybe there'd be some political pressure, but
It was Commissioner Ainge that, when I talked to him this morning, he said, he used the word filibuster. This is unbelievable.
So is there any way we want to change our resolution?
if you want to put language condemning the action, you could, but I think you want to try and have, and maybe I'm wrong, but I think you want to have a positive statement that basically says we agree with the Good Governance Advisory Board and we want to move forward.
if anything, you could say despite the actions of, or the fact that there's a petition otherwise, I don't know if you want to reference it at all, but just by passing this after what has already happened sends a message that we haven't changed.
And then you could maybe put pressure through the Daily Herald and the other newspapers and call on him to, publicly call on him to change his mind and let this thing go forward.
And I really like George's idea tonight of having Cameron ask the key questions so that it's publicly stated everything that we've done to get to this point. And he's a little bit hot right now about this, and he's excited to come tonight. So ask him all the questions that you might know the answer to, but would be good for the public record.
I used to coach soccer with him, and I like when he gets hot-headed.
His little face turns red, and he really does.
Mayor, do we have any information as far as what we think costs might be with this forum? Or is that something we want to get into? I just really believe in this so strongly, but we want to delve into those other issues.
We actually spent one whole meeting on breaking down costs, and we looked at all forms. If we were to stay the 3 full-time, if we were to move to 5, if we were to do a strong mayor and 5 city council, we vetted every single one. And it all stayed within right around less than, I think, $150,000. It was that small, and we talked to some legislators that day, and they said, please don't let money drive this. It's so important to get this done right that $150,000 isn't going to make a difference with all the time and money that's being wasted right now.
Ultimately, I think it would actually save money, even in the long haul, getting that kind of group together. And I really believe in this. And so, do you want me to talk about that? Do we want to talk about
So
that?
you can ask Cameron all those questions and he'll give you the exact answers. He actually wrote the document that we submitted this morning that got shut down, so he knows it inside and out, and he really wants to voice all the opinions. So think of everything, the public outreach piece, the financial piece, the different forms of government that we looked at. These are all key questions to ask so that it will go on the public record. And tonight he may say he can't speak to Commissioner Lee's actions. So if you bring that up, if he says that, it's just because we're in the thick of it now, and I think just for protection reasons in case something legal comes up. But he can speak to everything we did on the committee.
So, who is the person or party that has submitted the request? Because when you do a petition like this, there's either one person or a body of people that have submitted it.
5 signatories,
So,
which is required by law to initiate legislation.
so all
It's a
5,
citizen initiative.
all 5 would have to back out, or the majority of
That's
them?
a very good question. I'm sure that question's being asked today of the county's legal team. So if one pulls out, do they get a chance to go get another one? How does that exactly work? So, and I know the answer to that.
And if this ploy works this year, could the same ploy be used again next year?
Yeah.
So-
The county attorney is saying it's dead. That's what I just got on a text, that's his opinion, is that this effort is dead if they don't change, if they don't withdraw it.
Well, but that maybe even becomes a question for the state legislature and our legislators to address, that, this is a one-person pocket veto. It's like, I can do this, and now you can't do anything. And next year I can do the same.
So the members that did sign it, apparently so Billy's on it and then 4 others, and they're all in a group together, some group of some sort.
What, you don't know what kind of group? I mean, who are these other 4? Do we know anything about them?
I think they're Billy's.
We can give you the names here.
Heidi Baldery, Robert White, Heather Williamson, and Tim Westmoreland.
Along with Commissioner Lee.
So
we're gonna go forward with this tonight in our meeting. We'll
Okay. I'll
get as much
speak to it for a
information
minute
out as
and
we can.
Turn the time on the counter and you guys have that.
How do we get a little stronger result than what half an hour ago we thought we needed to get? I guess we just do the best we can do.
Well, I mean, we can talk about this more tonight too, but I think as a council, we would encourage you to speak up and
That'll be great.
speak
'cause I can say
publicly
the
as
council
strongly
supports
as,
me and-
yeah, and that we support you and that we're not happy with what's happened because we don't agree that this is something that hasn't had sufficient public input or hasn't been studied enough. I mean, those are the two things he said, which I think are.
So in our meeting tonight, who's gonna bring up the fact that this new thing has happened so that the public's aware? In other words, so our resolution just says like, oh yeah, we support the governor's committee and we support this, but this whole other thing's happening. And we're trying to get some public support to come out against that, or what we're trying to accomplish?
I'm at least I mean, I've got the Tribune article here, and I was going to just read what the Tribune said, Bill Lee said, because it's not a direct quote. They're attributing, Lee described the process as rushed, frustrating, and agenda-driven. He questioned whether there is sufficient public support and said more discussion is needed. So I want to ask Cameron that question directly. I mean, if it hasn't come up, I can just say, this is in light of his petition submitted this morning for a five-member city council, or county council. Is that what it's called, the county council?
I guess it would be, yeah.
Incidentally, if Lee's group were successful, this goes to the ballot, and even if it gets turned down, the county has to wait 5 more years before it can vote on change of form of government again.
So it just stays the same, yeah. That was another reason they tasked us to work fast. They gave us the 3.5-month window of time and said, you've got to work fast and furious, because if we don't do it now, it's off for 5 years, it's pushed off. So that was why we were meeting twice a week and going all around the county and doing all these. It's an interesting
Well,
dynamic.
that's interesting that you would have a deadline, but somehow he doesn't have a deadline. Because they're able to go beyond your deadline to collect signatures and basically derail the whole thing.
Oh my gosh, this is really why we need to change.
Like you said, Exhibit A, right? Okay, well, we'll talk more about this tonight. So we're at item 3 now, which is discussion regarding the proposed urban year control plan. And we'll bring, from the assistant city attorney to present.
I know you're all familiar with this topic, so maybe I can just focus on a couple of things. There's some differences between the previous core, the 2016 to 2019 core, and then the proposed urban deer plan for the 2019 to the 2022 core. And those, of course, you're familiar with. We moved to an all-lethal program. We'll no longer be doing the trap and translocate. We will have the trap and euthanize, and that does have the possibility of some extended hours so that some euthanization might occur during some of the darker hours. In the previous program, only the translocated animals were tested for chronic wasting disease. In this instance, the DWR is going to require that all animals 1 year and older be tested for CDW. And that is a cost in terms of labor. I put this little asterisk thing here because it seemed to me that one of the differences is that the first core was complaint driven, and that's where the sites were chosen according to resident complaints. And the most input we had at that time was from residential areas up in the northeast quadrant of the city. It seems to me that both members of the council and the police department have expressed concern currently about the deer killed in traffic and the public safety concerns. With the, so to me that appears to be a potential for the council to be directing a little bit different focus. I don't know what the council will decide to do, but if we do move more overtly toward a public safety focus, then that means that we may have to make some changes from last time.
Could you elaborate a little bit on that? What kind of changes?
I was going to get to it in about one more slide down,
Go
but
ahead.
essentially we'll need to find some different sites. So we have potential differences in results and risks, and of course this is a bit speculative. You'll remember previously we were able to talk about the number of animals removed with the lethal and non-lethal, 193 total, and that looks like a small number of animals relative to the cost. On the other hand, if those animals remained in the city and they've reproduced at the rate of about 2 per year, since most of those animals taken out are does, then one estimate would be that we'd have, right now we have about 565 fewer deer living within the city than we would have had it not been for those animals taken out by the first Corps. So I think it's important to keep in mind that what we're working on is a maintenance plan, and that the numbers taken out are not all of that's not the only impact. The impact comes in preventing them from reproducing within the city also. So in the coming plan, what is proposed is that the archery lethal removal continues, and then we also have the trap and euthanize. With the trap and euthanize, we have perhaps a bit of a opportunity for a potential larger harvest. The specialists who use archery, it takes them well over a year to be able to qualify to participate in Provo, because Provo is so densely populated that Humphreys really has fewer than 5 people that they will allow to do archery within Provo because they want that safety factor. The trap and euthanize will not require that kind of long-term training. We may be able to use some specialists that could get on the ground running earlier than the other specialists. And to be able to trap and euthanize should reduce risks in densely populated areas where you don't want to be shooting projectiles.
Question?
Yes.
On the trap and euthanization, who actually does that? Is it Humphreys that does that?
Yes.
Or do some of our, I know one of the negative things about the moving them and removing them was the danger to some of our people, or
Right.
animal people. Are they not involved in this now, or? will that
We anticipate that they are not going to be involved. I mean, animal control is always involved in deer removal by virtue of the fact that they
lessen?
remove the deer killed in traffic far more than the DWR does. The DWR in the prior Corps had the expectation that we would have 2 individuals assisting with removing the deers from traps and getting them in the trailers. And we had to have 2 people on the ground, and those were our animal control officers. Obviously, Humphreys will be coordinating with Jason Swenson, who's our chief animal control officer. But we don't anticipate, and there's no requirement that we have city personnel there to remove them from the traps. Yes.
So we did have an officer injured,
Right.
but it would seem in this case, if we're going to trap and euthanize, if they tranquilize or do something before anyone goes into the cage, the animal is not going to be resisting and kicking and hurting people. I don't know what their process is, but if they do it right, I don't see how anyone would get injured.
I think that's certainly the goal that Humphreys has. They don't want people in there wrestling the deer. And they shouldn't have to, since what they're going to be doing is euthanizing. So that should reduce the risk to those individuals. But Humphreys does carry its own insurance, and the city, under the requirements of the state, also has to have insurance for the urban deer control plan. The differences in the costs, I'll just review these, you're familiar with them. Previously, we had Humphreys with the flat fee of $10,000, and then we had capped costs on camera rental and on baiting. DWR gave us a flat fee per deer, but it did require animal control officer participation, which did run up some overtime and some other costs that didn't appear overtly in the contract. In our new proposed plan, Humphreys has a flat fee per site and then a flat fee per deer. They will need to coordinate with the police department, with DWR, but our people shouldn't need to be there. If we are to focus on roadway safety primarily and public safety, seems like, as I understand the process, Humphreys will need to survey the movements of the deer patterns near the roadways. This is North University Avenue, 900 East, North Canyon Road, and South State Street on the way to Provo. Those are where we get the most deer auto collisions or hits. One thing we're trying to do now is identify city properties near roadways that might serve as potential sites, because these higher speed roadways where the deer are getting hit tend to be primarily commercial areas, and so we haven't had the same kinds of complaints that we did from residents, and we don't know whether businesses feel like they have a stake in having the deer controlled. So we would want to identify commercial and residential properties that are also near the roadways to see whether they are potential sites. But it does appear to me that it will be a more complex process than it was in residential areas. In the residential areas, what Mr. Cook did was walk into go talk to the residents in a neighborhood, and frequently in that area of the city, he would be talking to homeowners, obviously, or at least, yes.
So when you get down into the urban core and you're more into the commercial areas, I would expect that you would be trapping more so than trying to bow hunt. And so you may need to have permission to have a trap, but you wouldn't have the risk of actually bow hunting in the center part of town.
Whichever method is used, we obviously need the property owner's permission, and we would not proceed without that permission. And my understanding is they would use whichever would be the most effective and the least risky method. On North University Avenue, there are some businesses that have considerable green space, and so it may be that it would be appropriate to use archery at certain times. I don't know, but that's sort of a layperson's view of some of those businesses, at least. So, do you have questions or concerns that are left? I did ask Hannah to upload a different version of the plan, and I have brought copies of that because the plan that was included in your agenda packet, because of my fault, included the non-lethal, and we will not have the non-lethal. So this version of the plan simply has deleted the non-lethal. And so I do have hard copies if any of you would like that. Yes?
Well, maybe you can answer this. So the resolution 2019, that first paragraph says, whereas residents report that urban deer eat and damage landscape plants, trees, and causing damage to personal and private property, live, breed, and defecate in residence yards. I thought we had taken that language out and substituted, so what I see in Exhibit A, I like much better. It says, whereas mule deer within the city, boundary of city are causing traffic accidents, significant property damage to landscaping, attracting predators, and are creating other threats to the public's health, safety, and welfare. And the reason why I'm concerned about that previous language is because maybe I'm speaking personally, but I don't think this program is so that people don't have deer scat in their backyard, right? I mean, this is about a public safety issue more than it is about the inconvenience of deer. I mean, I understand they're inconvenient. At some point, that inconvenience becomes property damage, and that's where I think so I just don't want the language in there to make it sound like, well, because I saw a deer in my backyard, I think it's worth the expense of the city to go through all this trouble when the pressing issue is damage to property and public safety. Does that make sense? So it's basically that phrasing about live, breeding, and defecating in yards.
So it sounds like that needs to be amended.
And I thought we had, I wondered if that was like old language or something that got back in there.
It is. That was one of the major drives, just as we were surveying the public a few years ago for the original plan. So some of the same language was borrowed for the same justification and continuing the plan. Because we have had, there was that one incident where the deer attacked a woman's dog and almost injured her as well before she could drive off. So there have been some definite public scares on people's property as well. But we can adjust some of the language if you'd like.
Yeah, I just think the language in the Exhibit A is sufficient because it describes property damage and public safety, but it doesn't get into the specifics of, the location of the deer is in someone's yard.
And you know better than I the mechanism for making that change. Whether that requires action in this meeting or just action in the next.
Right.
I think it would just mean, the implied motion would be to use the updated version.
Right, we just need a motion to modify the resolution. We can do that, so
I would move that we modify the resolution to include the language in Exhibit A in lieu of the paragraph there that starts on line 9.
First paragraph of the resolution 2019, it sounds like you would like that deleted and then use language from the second paragraph of the urban deer control agreement.
Easy to do.
Bryce passed a message on saying there's some concern to say the deer causing traffic accidents, so they altered the language because they weren't sure there's much of a traffic component to the program anymore. We know when the program was first started, that was one of the justifications, was all the deer that were getting hit by cars, the deer hitting cars.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite hear you, Cliff. What were you saying? Bryce?
Bryce had just indicated, just passed a clarification on that they were trying to change the language on the traffic accidents because it wasn't clear. So this says the deer causing traffic accidents.
Or are involved in?
Yeah.
Well, I suspect, I think the issue is that there was significant discussion in one of the previous meetings about whether we could precisely say whether the traffic accidents, whether the deer involved in the traffic accidents were urban deer or mountain deer. Right, and so I think what Bryce is indicating is that somebody, and I don't know who, I don't know where this happened, but somebody decided, let's take that out so we're not arguing over that.
Yeah, I think that's fine. My point is just that this paragraph is more accurate and less specific about, again, sort of, it's that line that really live, breed, and defecate, generally impairing the quiet enjoyment of their property. I think that's actually too much of a license to say that this is a reason to kill every deer we can find. Because we don't like them. And I know there are a lot of people who feel that way, but I think the real reason we're putting these resources here have to do with that second version.
What about a change like this? They are frequently involved in traffic accidents and cause sufficient harm.
That's fine, yeah.
Amended that way?
I think you want to take out the live, breed, and defecate.
Yes, so it's that first
Oh,
paragraph to
this would
delete.
replace this first paragraph,
Okay.
sorry.
Yeah.
I just wanted them on the screen at the same
Okay.
time.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so George has made a motion to make that change. So I'll need a second.
I'll second that.
Another point that the council should be aware of is that in the resolution, as I recall it, it's resolved to appropriate $10,000 for the deer control program. In the proposed agreement, that was drafted with 4 sites in mind, which would be the equivalent of the 10,000, and then that would not leave any money for the $75 per deer. So whatever decision the council makes, we would just want to be sure those 2 documents are using the same numbers.
So with that question, are they looking for a larger appropriation? We've got 4 sites at $2,500 each, which does not include the 75. Do we need to have a larger appropriation? And this year, from what I understand, it's coming out of general fund funds. And next year, we hope, or the next couple of years, we hope it will be in, is it the police budget? Is where we hope that to find that?
I think that's a decision the council would have to make. Mr. Cook said that right now they have 4 very productive sites. It sounds as though they'll need to change if we're going to focus more closely on roadways. So I think it's up to the council to decide how many sites they want, how many resources they want to use at this time. They were taking out about 33 deer a year via archery. He anticipates they will probably be able to take out more deer by using the trapping and the archery. So I don't know how you want to allocate funds for that.
Was it a total of 159 last year?
193 between the 2 programs.
So if there's more with this program than the 75 with deer, and it's over 200, that'd be $1,500. So if you had 4 sites at 25, that'd be the 10,000. And then the 200 deer would be another 1,500, so we're looking at
15,000.
That 193 was over 3 years, and it's
Oh,
2020
okay,
for next year.
okay.
Just so you know.
I'm just trying to figure out how we have to adjust that 10,000. Either we only have 3 sites and use the money for the deer, or we allocate more money and use 4 sites. I guess that's supposed to be.
So it looks like it's about 5,000 more a year from if we're continuing with the 4 sites.
And I didn't pencil it out, so.
Is there a reason why we couldn't go with 3 sites for the first year to see if that's,
It's entirely up to you, is my understanding.
knowing that we've reduced the population somewhat significantly already, I wonder if, a modest, a slightly more modest commitment this year is
Can we pass like it is and appropriate more if they need it?
Well, I think we can, but it seems to me that it's inevitable. If it's cost 25 to run the sites and then $75 a year,
Well, let's get more then, but
yeah.
if you know what it is, put it in.
And that'd just have to come out of the general fund at this point. Is that
That would be, not gonna be that much.
$5,000 isn't that much when you're talking general fund issues, but
When we go to 3 sites, it looks like, according to this graph, it would be 3,000.
then it'd be 3,000. 4 sites, 17,500, yeah.
What do you want us to do?
I think if it's expected and anticipated, this is what you're gonna spend, that's probably what we're gonna do.
Yeah, I hate to see us vote on a resolution of 10,000, knowing that that's.
We're gonna be back.
It's not enough money.
So do we want to go with a specific number or something more general, say up to 15,000?
I'm inclined to just go with the budget that's for 3 sites. That's more than we're, I don't know, say 13,000, or we could say up to 15,000 to give them a little extra breathing room.
Because will 13,000 actually pay for the number that we did last year and expect to come this coming year? That was my.
And there's expectation that he'll be more successful with the
Yeah.
organization rather than.
But if for some reason we appropriated more money than we needed, we always have the option to carry it over
Right.
and use it in subsequent year.
So I feel better about going like 15.
So we need a motion for that, Brian, to change that in the resolution?
We probably ought to vote on the other one first.
Can I go back to?
Discussion on the first motion we already.
Yeah, I'm wondering if adding, I saw, Hannah, you added urban there. I wonder if that's redundant.
Councilor Harding chimed in and said
Oh.
that he was interested in adding that. It is covered by within the boundary of the city.
Right,
but
and
it
I thought we
doesn't
were worried
make it
about
purpose
making a
specified.
distinction between urban and mountain anyway.
So,
Because I was not convinced that we had a firm definition of that distinction. So but maybe it doesn't make any difference legally, Brian, but it seems to me that urban deer within the city boundary is redundant anyway. We're just talking about mule deer within, and they're not checking to see, if they trap a deer and it's a mountain deer.
Show me your card.
I know.
I think that they have noticed that there is a difference, so that the urban deer are smaller deer than.
But they're going to euthanize them either way if they're in the way of traffic or
But
they're.
aren't they targeting the urban
it
deer?
can be difficult to tell because sometimes the mountain deer come down and remain urbanized. You can tell a difference between mountain deer and urban deer that were born in urban environments. They grow up differently. But relatively new Provo residents, you could say, hunt the deer.
Recent move-ins from California.
Still look like Californians, yeah.
I think the primary way they have of trying to target urban deer is by picking locations that they feel are sufficiently within the city boundaries that they're more likely than not to be resident deer.
Yeah, I just don't think we're I know they're doing that. We know that it's because of public safety, so we know where they're locating themselves. But they're not going to make a distinction between an urban or a mountain deer when they're euthanizing. So I don't think we should. That would be my preference. Just leave that word out and then and substitute that whole paragraph.
Well, I think, procedurally as it stands, it's your motion. So, if you don't want to add that change to your motion, then it would require an amended motion from Mr. Harding to put that word in.
This is how we're going to draw him into this meeting.
Okay, Dave Harding says, so he said, urban deer are the problem. We want to eliminate the urban deer, not the visiting mountain deer. He believes we're targeting urban deer. And then he said, we want to try to avoid killing the mountain deer, but he's fine leaving that word out. Leaving urban out in line 14.
I agree with him. I just don't know that unless we specify some word by ordinance that we don't want them to euthanize a mountain deer ever, that's not going to happen. I mean, I think we are targeting urban deer through the program, but I don't think.
I'd like to, let's vote on it.
Okay.
Let's go back to Mr. Hanley's original. So urban is out, and we're replacing in line 14 through 16 for 9 through 12. That's the motion. We have a second?
Yes.
Let's vote on that. All in favor of that motion? Okay, that's unanimous. All right. Now let's go to, does anyone want to make a motion on the dollars that are mentioned in the resolution? Isn't there a place in it where it says how much money appropriated?
Here, just seeing if there's anywhere else.
I would make the motion that we raise that to 15,000.
And we want to say up to $15,000 or just funded by $15,000?
I got two.
Sends a message.
Okay, so somebody want to make a motion
Up to
up to
$15,000.
$50,000?
I second Dave's motion.
So Dave can make a motion to change that to up to $15,000, and George Stewart seconds that motion. Any more discussion about that? Okay, all in favor of that change? Okay, that's unanimous also. All right, so this will come up tonight with those changes, and we'll have a little more discussion. Thank you.
Just two quick points. One is that I think Hannah has replaced the core in your agenda.
It was added, it was just missing.
Okay, it was added, so the current core is there. And then I spoke with Mr. Cook a short time ago. He's intending to attend the municipal council meeting tonight. However, he has had a family member with a medical emergency, so he may not be able to attend.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Our next item, discussion regarding the proposed amendments to personnel policies in Title IV, and Daniel Sockley from Human Resources will lead us next.
Mr. Chairman, let me just do a quick introduction, and we'll turn the time over to Daniel. As I indicated in the staff report, as you know, with the new budget, the mayor had proposed some changes to our leave policies and other elements. And as we began getting the final drafting done, the administrative policies, we discovered there were some inconsistencies with Title IV, which is our personnel section of the city code. As we began to look at what changes to make, we also thought it might be worth a discussion with the council before we get to final drafting of the proposed changes to Title IV, to talk philosophically a little bit about what should be in the code and what should be an administrative policy. As the mayor and Isaac and Daniel and I talked about this a week or so ago, what we kind of came down to was this idea of parameters versus practice. We trying to balance the needs of the council and their oversight responsibility with the needs of the administration to have a little bit of flexibility to respond to changing circumstances. We felt like maybe it would be well to at least kind of talk about what you would like to see in the code and what areas you would feel comfortable in allowing the administration to set policy by administrative order. We've done a lot of that over the years where the code has been unclear or inconsistent, just in an effort to provide clarity to directors and others involved. But we didn't want to go too far down that path without at least having a broad discussion with you about what should be in the code and what should be in administrative policy. We discussed last week, this week before last, with council leadership on this general topic, and the sense we got in visiting with the council chair and vice chair was that if we were a little more transparent in terms of putting our administrative policies out on the intranet, on the city's website, as opposed to just on the intranet, that at least the transparency issues related to having them in the code might be addressed effectively. But again, we didn't want to get in a position where we were taking away things that were important to you to have in the code. For example, the pay tables that establish the grades and steps, those probably do belong in the code because they're adopted each year with the budget as changes are made in the budget process. But maybe some things like whether we front load vacation hours in the first 6 months of an employee's tenure with us may not be quite as important to put in the code. That may be better served by putting in administrative policy. So we asked Daniel to come today and to talk specifically about the changes that we think ought to happen regardless, largely as the result of the proposed personnel changes, family leave, and some of those kinds of things we've talked with you about. But to maybe just have a little broader discussion about where you see the most effective place to draw lines in this, and then if there are some things that could come out of the code and be left to administrative policy, with the mayor's signature, and then putting them out on the website. If that would satisfy your concerns about transparency and predictability, or whether it's something you would prefer to continue to see in the code and have us come back to make changes to the code regularly. So we want to kind of have the philosophical discussion, and then we can get into some more specifics about what we think needs to happen to make the code consistent with our administrative practice.
So your purpose is this a discussion and just
Yeah,
get some feedback? and then-
Yeah, we'd like to draft and bring you some changes soon, but we'd also like to just have maybe a little more philosophical discussion. Daniel can raise some specifics and talk about kind of the spectrum of, code versus administrative policy, and then let's kind of see where the discussion goes.
Yeah, one of the things I'd like to kind of point out today is maybe some of this is code that's been set up for a couple of decades in some situations, and in some areas, the code is basically a verbatim copy of our city policy, and in other areas, it's completely silent on an issue. One of the ones that came up when I was going through the code is trying to identify what those are. The sick leave policy is one, or the sick leave and the vacation leave accrual policies are one that are almost identical. Well, they are essentially identical to what we have in our city policy. So they require an X amount of hours per biweekly pay period. It kind of outlines, after 5 years you go here, after 10 years you go here. You'll do it bi-weekly. It's based on working a full 80 hours. So that is very well stated, and yet at the same time, as far as I can tell, there's nowhere in the code where we talk about giving benefits, medical benefits to full-time employees. And so the question then becomes is which one of those should we be at? Should we be basically a repeat of our city policies, or should we be silent on some of these? And so what I've done is I've just gone through the code, tried to identify the areas that I think have questions, and then that will lead into kind of a more general discussion on what the philosophy should be, or what the council desires. I did take advantage of the opportunity as well, while going through the code, is to identify a couple of other changes that need to happen. Most of those are the ones that I'll bring up are fairly straightforward. For example, if we're going to be updating the code, let's not waste an opportunity to do that all at once. So for example, with the Development Services Department that is being formed, one of the things that has to be updated in the code, that will come in the language when we draft it, is to add that to our list of department directors that we have in the code already. So let's see. The first one is found in 4.02.030 of the code. It's dealing with our vacation and our sick leave. Currently, the ordinance states that we accrue it bi-weekly. There is a 6-month waiting period on when you can use your vacation, and if you leave during the first 6 months, you forfeit that. That's a carryover from when we used to have a 6-month probationary period. When you hired on, you had to serve 6 months, and so the code, which matched our policy at the time, said if you leave during that probationary period, which was 6 months, you lose your vacation and you're sick. The new policy that was signed in place by the mayor essentially is in response to our efforts to be more competitive in the recruitment. The employee does not get any more leave during the course of the first year, but we will give them their first 6 months of biweekly accruals up front. And we will take off the restriction to allow them to use it right away. This enables us to recruit those who don't want to start with 0 in their leave balances, and gives them an opportunity to have that flexibility during the first 6 months of employment. As a result of that, we also changed the policy a little bit to say, instead of if you leave during the first 6 months, if you leave during any time in your original probationary period, which is a year, you will forfeit the leaves that have been given to you at that point. So it's a small tweak to an existing code already. Any questions on those?
So you're saying you protected the city against someone taking the time off and then leaving the city
Immediately, yeah.
Because that would be a temptation.
Yes.
Yes, that is the result.
Protecting it, why not? helps you be competitive.
Yeah. The intent is obviously, to help us in recruitment, to give employees flexibility. Sometimes we often have employees who, they start and they have other plans, that are in 2 or 3 months' time, and they have no vacation or they're not allowed to use that. This enables them to transition to us more smoothly than they have in the past. But we do want to protect against someone who comes in, realizes that they don't really like it, or it doesn't work for them, and then they leave and they take the accruals with them that were uploaded or front-loaded for them. Yeah. So again, no change to the overall. They're not getting any more than they were originally before. They're just getting it earlier.
And anything that has a fiscal impact should be in code, in my mind. Because we're responsible for the budget. So if it has fiscal impact, and it should be something that should be reviewed by the county, I think that might be the anyway.
Yeah, I don't have any draft language, so this will be helpful. The next section, where I feel like there's some inconsistency, is still in 4.02.030, but this goes down to kind of the subsections 6, 7, and 8. We're dealing with, it spells out what the rules are for death leave, jury duty, and military leave. In the code, it's called annual encampment. Well, that is referring specifically to when someone goes out to an annual encampment and there's 3 weeks. Usually we'll pay them for those 3 weeks. They can collect money also from the military during that time. But there are other elements of leave that are allowed by city policy that are not specifically outlined in here. So for example, organ donor leave. It does not mention anything about FMLA, which is governed by federal law. It does not talk about military leave beyond annual encampment, which allows an employee to leave for up to 5 years because they go into active duty. That is silent on it as well. And so the question then becomes is how do we address the new leave that the mayor implemented, which is parent leave for those who have given birth or adopt a child, whether that should be included in the code or whether or not the code should step back from those if they're not going to cover all of them.
In other words, you wanted to mention that the council could put in the code something like the administration has authority to provide these kinds of leaves and make them general.
Yeah, exactly. It's a matter of whether or not you're giving the administration flexibility, but still retaining the oversight over that. And as I said earlier, one of the most interesting things about that is the code doesn't mention anywhere where it grants full-time employees medical coverage, at least that I could find. The only mention in there is dealing with employees who were hired before 1987 who then are retired. They're eligible to get health coverage, and yet there's nothing in there that guarantees that for employees.
It should be in there.
Right.
Again, I assumed that the parental leave policy would be reviewed by the council budget-wise because it has a big budget impact. I've been mayor and I'm on the council, and I think the council has to look at things that have fiscal impact. I don't think a mayor should have the ability to make him or herself popular with the employees at a cost to the city, which if they could do it administratively, could it be a temptation? I figured when I made changes, they were going to be voted on by the council if they had fiscal impact.
As a practical matter, we did include in the mayor's budget message that this was the intent to do the front loading of vacation and to allow parental leave. And so it wasn't something we were trying to do in a corner. This was really about disclosure. But the question then became, do we bring it as a code amendment? Do we put it in administrative policy? What is the right parameter for this? And that's what we're trying to explore a little bit today.
But if it stayed as a policy, it would still have to come out of the budget.
Yeah, we're still
there'll
under
be a
budget
budget
constraints.
somewhere to cover it, so it's not like it's going to be added and just come out of the general fund. It'd have to fit into a budget category to do that, right? I mean, that's what you're saying, George. It impacts the budget, but it wouldn't impact the overall budget, that would seem to be
Some of
impact
the
the
major
category.
stats should be in code, in my mind.
So, for example, it's called death leave in the code, but it's really referring to funeral leave, which allows for it by code, and yet it's coming out of existing leave balances that are given somewhere else. So there's no financial impact to the budget per se, it's just allowing them to use accruals that are given elsewhere in the code. So that's a great question, whether or not that's something that needs to be spelled out in code if there is no particular financial impact on that one as well. Same thing, you could probably extend that out too. The parental leave, the financial impact is difficult to gauge. You can go based on averages, and yet it's more of a lack of productivity because of their absence, as opposed to additional money that is spent for, you know, that parent leave. So, if that makes sense.
Well, it could happen that because of parental leave, you would need to have staff.
Correct.
So it would have some impact.
And that's the same, similar to for others, if people have an injury or illness, then you also have to have overtime policies in place where you have to bring in more people to work overtime or a temporary person, depending on how long it is. And those aren't necessarily addressed by code either. So
I would support anything that comes back from the administration that fits that parameter, that if it has a fiscal impact, then let's put it in code. If it doesn't have fiscal impact, I mean, that would be my recommendation, but I'm just one person.
Dave?
So do we have any example or model on the state level with their policies and how what do they put in the code and what do they have in policy?
I have not looked at that. I don't know. I can't speak to that. I would imagine that they don't have all of their internal practices as a matter of state code.
Right, and I just wondered how they differentiated.
No, we could also look at, you know, other cities in our form of government and see what they've included in code and what they haven't. That might be a really good place to look.
I mean, you bring up a great point, George, but I'm just kind of wondering, is there a standard out there, an industry standard or something?
Right.
From what I've seen,
Pass legal, it needs to pass administrative. John's department, they need to feel comfortable with it, and then if those two departments feel comfortable with something that meets that criteria, I think it needs to be brought to us, what you'd like us to do.
Yeah, well, we intend to do that. I think what we were trying to do today was just understand if there are some bright lines for you that would help us in coming up with a drafting strategy.
And at the end of the day, even if it doesn't go into code, you still have your budget power, right? I mean, if a mayor were to propose a policy that had an impact on the budget, and even sign it and say, here's an executive order that says, here's my new policy regarding X, at the beginning of the budget year, you can just refuse to approve the budget, so that the mayor wouldn't have the money to do it.
The mayor wanted to do something administrative during the budget year.
Well, then they'd either have to come for an appropriation, right? They'd have to come for an appropriation, or else transfer money from somewhere else.
As long as it's covered, I'd like to give the mayor as much flexibility as possible. But we need to, again, do what we're supposed to be doing as council.
You know, we might get some pushback on separation of powers, but you could also have a more, if you would get less specific and broader in your provisions, you could also theoretically have the mayor bring policies forward just to get council's approval along the way, and have, kind of like we have a council handbook. And I've seen that over the years, some of these Section 4, these Title 4 type things be incredibly detailed, and others have been, you know, down to a few paragraphs. So it really just depends on what the council of any given city are comfortable with. And I would agree with George that really anything that comes forward that has a fiscal impact, whether it's a policy change or something that's off budget, even when you decide to change ordinances from a council initiative, we ought to be looking at what the potential fiscal impact is. And a lot of these things you can estimate based on what's happening in the city. And with that in mind, I think, maybe as a test, we should also look at the cell phone discussion and see if we can't put some numbers to that. So, as you mentioned, some of the directors were concerned about it, so.
I mean, some of the simple is increasing the car allowance for directors needs to come too. I know I had to submit that.
Hold that thought, because that's coming up too. To your point, I mean, the next area that I want to talk about is in 4.02040, dealing with classifications and pay plans. Right now, the policy, if you go down to 3, this is dealing with kind of where directors, when they hire an employee, where they put them at. The code right now is fairly strict on that, in that it says the minimum rate of pay should be paid, saying you need to bring them in at step 1. There is some discretion that is allowed, but the code is basically sending the message you need to be there at step 1 unless there's a demonstrated inability to recruit at the minimum or the new employee possesses qualifications warranting employment at a higher rate in the pay range. One of my recommendations is to basically say that it's up to the administrative discretion where to bring that individual in based on their qualifications, rather than sending the message that they need to come in at step 1.
You're saying on a director's level that has to start at step 1?
Well, that's what this is saying.
That's the director and the mayor.
Exactly. And this is an area where we need to expand it out to give administrative authority to do that. Right. But to your point is where this is when you approve the budget, you approve an X amount of dollars, and when you're trying to hire, if that person fits within those X amount of dollars, then the director should be allowed to, bring them in at that particular rate. So, but this is just to kind of illustrate this. This particular part of the code shows up in 3 different areas. I mean, the next one is in 404.010, where it's talking about entrance pay. I think that's the same thing, and then moves on from there. Now, as far as the area that I said let's come back to, such as car allowance, if you go to 404.020, Cliff, which is... Oh, sorry. I saw your hands moving when it was going. Or 04, so I'll back it up a little bit. Yeah, 404.020. There is this one is dealing, hang on, let me find it, sorry. 020 is dealing with total remuneration. What this is basically saying is this is the only one that it outlines. It says, you are an employee is going to be paid based on the grades and steps that are assigned. And it says, any salary rate established for a class shall represent the total remuneration for full-time employment in the class, but shall not be considered as including reimbursement for official travel or other official expenses. No employee shall receive pay from the city in addition to the salary authorized under the schedules provided in the pay plan for services rendered by the employee, either in the discharge of ordinary duties or any additional duties which may be assigned or which the employee may undertake or volunteer to perform. Essentially what this part of the code is saying is that you're assigned a grade and a step, and then that represents the total amount of money that is paid to the employee. Well, I can tell you right now that does not account for other pays, such as car allowance, which is not necessarily a total reimbursement, that are very standard in government agencies, including our own, for several years. These are dealing with, it does not allow, by the strictest interpretation of this, for pay for temporary assignment, car allowance, performance bonus, service awards, sick leave buyout, safety awards, and in a couple of instances we also have specialty pay for basic assignments. This is one where I believe it needs to be expanded, not necessarily, and this is why this conversation is having, not necessarily to outline all the details and match the policy in code, but yet to give administrative direction to allow those practices.
You know, I have confidence that you, working with administration, could bring us changes in the code that would be updating our practices and recommend what should be code, and what should be administrative, or let us see it.
That's our intent.
I appreciate that. Yeah, my intent is to bring language forward that gives that acknowledges that those exist, and yet gives and allows it by, accepted policy, and obviously all of that still is factored into the annual budget. So
we shouldn't be doing things that are against the code, so let's update the code.
Yeah. Okay.
I tell you that, Mr. Stewart, are there any council members that would have it go in a different direction than just the fiscal? Okay, is that
We'll get some more
feedback
done.
that you needed?
That's very helpful, thank you.
The next one is dealing 404030, if you just go down a little bit, talking about pay rates in transfer, promotion, or demotion. This is an area, again, that we think should be dictated by city policy rather than repeating the code, or repeating the language. You're talking about very specific things about moving an employee, they get at least 10% in a promotion, as long as they are being paid within the pay grades, which are established in other parts of the policy. To me, that should suffice. And this is more lengthy than it needs to be.
You completely.
Any other? I'm looking more for the disagreeing votes. Okay.
I don't think you have any, Dan.
Perfect. All right, I just don't want to overstep. There are some slight changes I would like to make to section 404-040 regarding overtime payment. When reading through this, the very first sentence says, all approved overtime by employees and supervisors shall be reimbursed by comp time at 1.5 or by salary. I have a bit of a problem with that language in the sense that you have to pay overtime whether or not you approved it or not legally. You will then have to deal with the employee if they are working overtime without your approval. But all overtime, whether it's approved or not, must be paid. And then I would also add some language about which positions are designated exempt. Right now in the code, I think it's fine, but it does specify that those in the executive performance plan shall not be eligible for reimbursement for overtime. There are positions that are outside of that. This doesn't preclude you from doing that, but I would like to clarify that there are positions that are designated. The last thing is dealing with 4-04.060, and this is the classes in the salary ranges. Looking for direction on this as well, because this comes down to the concept of you approve a budget, and then how much flexibility does the mayor and administration have to work within that budget during the year. Not everything, regardless of whether or not you're starting a new department or creating a new position that the city needs, happens during the course of the year. Historically, how we've done this is we make those adjustments during the year, and if they fit within the pay plan, which is the section before, we may reclassify a position or create a position for administrative need, assign it to that pay grade, it covers under existing monies, and then as part of the budget process next year, we update the code, and the council has an opportunity to see any changes that have occurred in the year and approve it or pull it back as a part of the next budget process. The question then becomes is when should that be occurring? George?
In other words, as long as it's within the budget, right, or it's assumed that you can make those changes.
Yeah, what I would like to do is add some clarifying language that this is essentially reviewed annually as part of the budget process by the council.
There's no way the council could realistically review that kind of information during the year.
I don't think so either. I think it bogs down the process, and it significantly limits the ability for the city to act quickly. So.
I was just saying, this year, for example, when you authorized the creation of a deputy chief of police, we updated the code to allow for that. We added the position on here And when the budget was adopted, it actually showed up in here at the right place.
Yeah, typically what happens is I'll update this as part of the budget process. Most of the changes are over here on the right that deal with the grades that are assigned to them. But as you'll know, when you go through the budget, oftentimes there's either a new position or there's a change in the title of that position. We don't want to have to come to the council and waste your time changing a title of a position from, coordinator to a specialist or something along those lines. So as long as it's within the budget, that's been our interpretation as well. But I'd like to get that clarity because it's not always clear from council to council or administration to administration. And I think those are the main areas. So.
Can I make a suggestion?
Yeah.
If you go to 4.04, you need to replace 4.02. Okay, so scroll down to 5.0 and 6.0 and 7.0. Should get them all on one screen.
4.02.
Okay.
4.02. So as I hear the proposal from Daniel softly is that as we go through, rather than having all the great detail that you saw before, we'll end up with language that's much more like this, which is just very general in purpose and authorize the administration to do what it is you want them to do.
Yeah, in general, I think it's going to be a lot less specific rather than just repeating city policy, which can be quite lengthy because it has to take into account multiple different scenarios. So.
Okay.
Very good.
I think we have any. Thank you very much. We'll be back to-
Thank you.
We'll be back.
We now go to item 5, which is a discussion regarding a proposed amendment to Provo City Code to amend the title, purpose, and objectives to the 50 East Project Redevelopment Option Zone, Spring Creek neighborhood. Robert Mills will lead that.
Afternoon, everyone. Thank you. So this request relates to the 1320 South residential project that you folks saw at the last meeting and approved the zone change for. The zoning that was applied to that is a pro zone that's existing on our books. However, the applicant wanted to do an amendment just to change the title of that specific zone and the purpose and objectives because pro zones are very site-specific and project-specific, and while the parameters of that zone applied well to that specific project, some of the language in the existing zone did not. So these are just some changes, updating the language in there. So yeah, basically just changing the title of the zone. They chose entry-level housing as a project redevelopment zone. The intention was also to add another tool, quote unquote, in our toolbox, that this is a zone that could possibly be replicated for projects similar to this in the future if they ever occur, that would allow a site-specific zone but with general language that could apply to a variety of different projects. So the original language specifically identified a project at 50 East. That's clearly not the case anymore, so just very minor non-substantive changes. So
I really like this, the idea that if you make it a little more general, it could be applied to other projects that might come along rather than being so specific that it really only applies to one thing and that's all it would ever apply to. Because we don't necessarily want to have any more pro zones than we need, right?
Right. And that way, just to kind of piggyback off of Mr. Connect's comment there, that we have the development agreement process that makes it specific to that project. For instance, the 1320 South project, had a minimum requirement of parking and set a maximum amount of units that could be developed on that project, even though the zone would allow more units and less parking.
So, not that we don't have enough to do already, but how many pro zones are there?
There are 35.
35. And I'm just guessing, you tell me, are there some that are so close to each other that they obviously are unique, but if the language was broadened, you could combine some, perhaps many, into an umbrella of a zone that is more general?
Probably. I think that's the intent of like the low-density residential, medium-density residential zones that we have as well, to apply a little bit broader language that would allow similar types of projects and things like that, rather than naming an individual zone and
Right.
having that only apply at that one.
So what I'm getting at is we have 35 exceptions that people felt that our existing rules didn't address. And it's almost like, well, is there some commonality here to the point where either we change our existing rules to better address the needs that have been addressed by these pro zones, or maybe even create a new zone that gives the flexibility that we don't currently allow in our current zones?
I'm not sure how to best answer that, other than I personally feel that it's advantageous to have both options, that you have these pro zones that can be specific or that they can be a little bit broader. And again, through the development agreement process, any zone that's applied to a piece of property can be very site specific.
I totally agree. I mean, I like having the pro zone option. I'm just wondering what, if anything, we are learning from, it's been, 14 years or whatever since we started the pro zones, and is there some lesson to be learned so that we can go back and say, well, if we change our existing ordinance, there's less likely that others will come in and ask for a pro zone because we're being more flexible, or what's the commonality that they're stumbling over, if there is any commonality?
And I honestly couldn't tell you. The only thing that I can say is it's a lot to manage.
Yeah. When
you have that many zones, it's a lot to manage. So that's why we try and discourage applicants from going that way.
And we just finished looking at the A&S overlay, and it's like, they're not that different.
Exactly.
So the little bit of massaging, we get one ordinance that's easier.
And the more that we can do that, the more opportunities that we can identify to make our zoning ordinance easier to administer as well as understand from the public's point of view. I think those are wins.
Very good. Brian?
I have one procedural comment in this. I noticed in reviewing the resolutions and ordinances from last meeting that when you approved the rezone in the last meeting, the way it was written, it presumed that these changes had already been made, even though they hadn't. I mean, it specifically referred to the entry-level housing pro zone, which, because of these changes, didn't actually exist yet. So, in the meantime, what I did is I advised the mayor, I asked the mayor to not sign it into effect until this passes. The reason why you need to know that is this is one of those items where, because it just went to the Planning Commission, you have the right tonight to ask for it to go to the next meeting. If you pass it tonight, the mayor can sign both and everything works out just fine. If you don't pass it tonight, I've advised the mayor that she probably ought to veto the one that you passed 2 weeks ago so that it doesn't go into effect before this one goes into effect. Does that make sense?
I get a sense of the council members that we're going to not want to pass this tonight or want to go to the next meeting? Or any strong feelings to do that?
This looks good.
Okay. I just go forward tonight. Yeah. Thanks, Brian.
Thank you.
Thanks, Robert. That ends our business in the work meeting. There has been a request for a closed session. Brian, do you want to introduce that?
Yes, we have 3 items for consideration in closed meeting. 2 of them are regarding potential sale of property, which, as you know, is an acceptable reason for closed meeting. The other one has to do with character and competence of individuals, or at least that's the statutory way of phrasing it. It has to do with meeting some potential nominees for boards and commissions. So, based on those reasons, it would be appropriate to move to close the meeting.
So we look for a motion then to close our work meeting and go into a closed session. George Stewart made the motion, second. George Hamlin, all in favor? And I assume we'll be moving to the... Thank you.
Just an informational point, that